Hello, welcome to episode 64. I'm Mike, that's Vince, but we're back to doing new comics. And it's just us this week, but it's some big releases. Vince, how's it feel back to be reviewing new books after a month of retro stuff in gimmicks?
It has its positives and negatives. Luckily, I think this week it was mostly positive. I wasn't really mad at, I don't think really anything that we read this week.
No,
Granted,
I would
I
say
don't,
same. I was happy that I was gonna say I was happy we didn't have a huge rundown. We have a relatively nice shorter rundown compared to some other weeks.
yeah, it's pretty small. I was going to joke, though, that granted, I don't read Amazing Spider Man.
I mean, you don't, but I still to this day will not know what your gripe with that book is, and one of these days we'll unearth it. But it's fitting that you mention it because that is how we're going to start our show. It became the staple of our show to start with Amazing Spider-Man when it came out. So we're going to do that now with Amazing Spider-Man number 65, and still Nick Spencer, but the double Federico art team: Federico Vincentini and Federico Sabatini. And this is part 3 of King's Ransom, and it concludes next week with a giant-sized Amazing Spider-Man issue, which I believe then leads into the next Nick Spencer big mega arc, which is kind of what he does every few months or so. At this point, this is what you come to expect. We've had almost 75 issues if you count everything, possibly more with this, but with that bunch of moving parts here in the beginning. Of this issue. The beginning sees Norman Osborn kind of like making the play with Wilson Fisk to leave him and Harry alone and buying some time before Fisk has all the villains strike on him because he wants Kindred. We have Robbie and Tombstone battling to get their kids back, and I enjoy the back and forth between those are two rivals against each other, but they got to put their feelings aside to get their kids back. Who they're also struggling the feelings of finding out that their kids are dating each other, which provides some entertainment. Robbie's able to signal out Spider-Man for him to converge on their location, making it so he can make the saving day play here. Pete next sets up his sights on where Boomerang's gone because last issue Boomerang left, and he's using Gog to help him sniff out where it is where he's taken. But Spidey knows he's going to need some extra help as Kingpin's hired all the villains to go after Spider-Man to get that last piece of the tablet. So Spidey's reached out to Hawkeye, Spider-Woman, Wolverine, Iron Fist, Luke Cage, and Jessica Jones. It's a new Avengers reunion, I guess, as Pete looks to prepare for the next part of Kingpin's plan. We also see Norman reaching out to someone in Ravencroft in the shadows for help. So that's our lingering plot thread, tease for the next part. This has been a fun arc. I think the next issue probably is the death of that new costume, since Spider-Man's in his regular suit on the front cover of Giant Size next week. But overall, this is what you've come to from Nick Spencer's run at this point. And, if you're still enjoying it, you're probably still enjoying this. Art here, I'm going to scream and echo into the ether of what our biggest gripe with this book is not a consistent art team, where the double Federico team here is just, it's not as good. It's a little messy. It's a little flat in places, but I expect next week's to kind of be a lot bigger and grander with the giant size label slapped on top of the book. But at this point, that's what you're coming to expect from Nick Spencer's Amazing Spider-Man. Still good. I'm enjoying it.
So Iron Fist Heart of the Dragon, I actually missed 2 issues in between. Either we were doing a retro week or I missed a show. Of course, this is written by Larry Hama, art by Dave Wachter. So very, very quick, slight recap of the issues I missed. So Sunspot showed up, Okoye. Oh, and Sunspot he showed up and then he kind of disappeared. But Okoye showed up from Wakanda. She's a Black Panther character, one of the Dora Milaje. There's lots of flashy action, and then Okoye ended up betraying them by killing a dragon. So that's where we come into this issue. But I guess she was meant to absorb its chi as sacrifice to then boost the side of the good guys. So, there's a short misunderstanding fight with Iron Fist, obviously. And then they all, figure out, hey, there's bigger things at hand here. And she has powers now, related to that. And I have a very minor sneaking, possible theory that the end of this series might be like, hey, Okoye is the Iron Fist, or at least a new Iron Fist. But I'm not sure. There's a standoff and fight with the villains, but then that gets disrupted, so they all have to go fight a ghost dragon. And that's basically the final page / tease here. And this is still maintaining that great classic Marvel feel in the writing from Hama, and also slick storytelling / action from the art. There's one more issue. I don't think I'll be able to read that before the pre-order is due for the trade this month. So I'm really going back and forth on how I feel about the series overall. I think I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been a great comic, and it integrates so much Iron Fist lore and outside fun guest appearances. You know what we've been enjoying in certain other titles like Iron Man under Cantwell. Really, like, this is all right up my alley, but it's kind of lingering whether I actually want it on my shelf. But that's my anxiety to bear, and I'll probably have to make that pre-order decision before I read the next issue, and then I'll tell you guys what I think of the next issue, assuming that we actually cover it. But that's Iron Fist. Really, really fun comic book.
Over in the Swamp Thing #3, Ram V, Mike Perkins, Mike Spicer. Levi's friend Jessica is giving him a CAT scan to see what's going on inside his brain and see if they can figure out what's going on with him. And inside, he's hearing the voice of the Green, which inside the CAT scan machine, where they send him in, it transforms into Swamp Thing and makes all the elements around it. Plants start bursting out, and Jessica's looking at the scan and sees his brain turn into like a plant seed, which is pretty interesting. Like, the visual layout of that double page spread was really, really cool looking, which, we'll talk about the art on this book. It's great. I still think Mike Spicer's colors are just really kind of what makes the book, paired with Mike Perkins' pencils. But, Jessica goes out to check, see what's going on. She gets sucked into the Green with Levi, and they get separated on the inside. Swampy meets Ivy, who asks him to come with her to where it's safer, and she's taking him to Ivy's, I guess, Queen persona. I don't know much about the two different Ivy personas here. It's Poison Ivy when I say Ivy, by the way, which I guess is the more poison side of her that's evil, while just the Ivy side is, more good. I don't exactly know the dichotomy between the two with the with Poison Ivy being integrated into the Green, but the short story here is that something inside the Green is going down, and it's going to be bad, and it's transforming it, and they need a new avatar, that being Levi as Swamp Thing, to stop it and save the Green. And they take him to Alec Holland, who's presumably going to teach him to learn deeper and find out what's going on. And Jennifer gets rescued by Jason Woodrue, who's the Floronic Man, if you don't know who that is, and meaning now that's going to be a complete race against time now for Levi to probably rescue her before Floronic Man does his normal shtick. But overall, still liking this, but it feels much more disjointed in areas from the first two issues. But it's this is now what, 3 of 10, I think. So I'm sure I have complete faith that the team delivers with some or on exposition for the next issue. Perkins and Spicer's art is still here to shine, especially with the Spicer's colors, which I gushed about earlier. But every issue it's been great, especially with just the background colors and skies in general, which is what really makes it. But I'm interested to see how Alec Holland is working in here. But I would say this is still, maybe the most intriguing and interesting book out of Infinite Frontier for me. I'm enjoying pretty much all the ones I'm reading, but this is the one that I'm like definitely want to see where it goes the most. So I'll hand it over to Vince.
Yeah, not a ton to add. The big, huge monster thing is cool. The whole Ivy / poison, that split thing that's going on here is interesting. I'm pretty sure that's just new to this issue. I don't think that's picking up from anything else. But it's interesting, and we will see Ivy later on in the show. So
yeah, we'll see her first appearance.
Some parallels later. Alec Holland getting pulled into this is pulling me into it closer. Kind of been, I've commented on the previous issues, like, there's totally precedent for other characters being Swamp Thing, and there being multiple Swamp Things, all kinds of stuff like that. But for me, generally, I just want like the Swamp Thing, which is like Alec Holland, or quote unquote Alec Holland. So it's at least really interesting to see him in here. And I think, never mind. I think this is it. It slightly reminded me of some of that Justice League Dark that I very occasionally checked in on, which was Ram V. Doing Swamp Thing, and the art here is brilliant. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I'm definitely going to keep following it, and kind of this third issue right at the right time, kind of put the second hook into me. So I think I will definitely stick through, the 10 issues, and maybe it gets extended. That's I actually see Mike Perkins. He promotes this book really heavily in like Swamp Thing fan groups on Facebook. He'll show like the black and white art and things like that, and I think that's really cool. And I hope this book's doing well and they're having fun doing it and everything like that.
Which is what we've been saying from the beginning, is like this team, we like the two future state issues. We're like, if this continues to be well, and I think it's being perceived pretty well too, I wouldn't be surprised if it gets turned into a full-blown ongoing, or at least like a season 2 thing later on. But do those good thoughts head over to Green Lantern as we're on there? I think the last time we did new books, we did the first issue of Green Lantern. Now it's Jeffrey Thorne's second issue.
Yeah, for the most part. I think I'm slightly cooler on this issue than the first one, but this is Jeffrey Thorne, art by Dexter Soy and Marco Santucci. Honestly, I don't really know where the split is for that. Like, I can't tell which page is which, or if I don't know how they're doing the art on this book. But John Stewart recaps the whole Lantern Corps on what went down in the last issue. There's a terrorist attack. Oa joined the United Planets, and one of the Guardians died. So we have a little funeral here, and one of the Guardians refers to the Lanterns, like all of the collective Lanterns, saying that many of them are mammals and many primates. And I'm not really sure how I feel about that when referring to aliens from all over, even the ones that look very humanoid. Like, are there mammals and primates on other planets? But whatever. Don't think too hard on any of those kinds of things. The big status quo shift here is that 1,200 sectors, the Green Lantern Corps is divided in sectors, regions of space. 1,200 of them are being abandoned to the UP. And that's a third of the previously total sectors. And all those lanterns have been reassigned. Some of them are stuck on Oa. That's where Simon Baz is left. Some are off doing quests, or they're basically like liaisons and bodyguards for the United Planets, all kinds of things like that. Hal Jordan gets assigned to Earth because, of course, very convenient. And as you might imagine, all the lanterns that are assigned to those 1,200 sectors, it's a very sudden change, and some of them are kind of annoyed or pissed off. And John's trying to talk to the Guardians like, hey, this is really drastic and very sudden. And it just shows the Guardians, being their usual standoffish jerk selves. And they introduced this idea, and this is the thing that, like, I mean, in the Marvel universe, in Marvel comics, there's something that you have to get past or just accept, that like 85% of the entire Marvel universe happens in and around New York City. Like, yes, over time they introduced lots of characters from outside of New York, even other countries and everything like that, but almost all of it happens in New York. It's just like superheroes disproportionately are in New York. And in DC, it's way more spread out as far as the United States and even arguably the world. But when you get on a cosmic level, it's like, okay, still, like, most of the superheroes in the universe, at least the ones that we see, are on Earth. It seems very disproportionate. And the Guardians and every once in a while, like, because of course, DC, some writer or editor or whoever is like, we need to explain that because stupid. And so the Guardians basically are like, there's this idea of crux worlds, and Earth is like one of the major crux worlds. So it results in a lot of superheroes, and that's why there's like 5 freaking human Green Lanterns exist all within one human lifetime. And there possibly would have been more, but Krypton exploded, or more in like Crux worlds were like nearby, but Krypton exploded, and then John Stewart exploded the planet himself. But what many lanterns are assigned to is this giant quest because there's something far away cosmic nonsense. It kind of sounds like the whole plot line that Snyder's Justice League and the Flash were going through with the source wall being screwed up. It sounds a lot like that. There's something in the far reaches of space that's going on, and John Stewart is basically in charge of an army of 1,000 lanterns, and he has to go check that out. And so they all jump in their ship. All the other ones go off to what they need to do, and they're all gone. And then suddenly the battery on Oa blows up, and the Green Lantern from Far Sector, which is a book I haven't read, but I've heard fantastic things about it. I think it's still barely finishing. It might have 1 or 2 more issues to come out. But that character, I guess her name's Jo Malene. She shows up on Oa, and it seems that whichever Green Lanterns were still on Oa, they're dead. And Teen Lantern is still there, who isn't technically a Green Lantern. And Simon Baz might be dead. And that's kind of where we leave here. So I guess we're going to keep interweaving these plots. When the first issue came out, we commented how the cover really emphasized Teen Lantern, but she wasn't like super prominent. And it does seem like maybe Jeffrey Thorne is going to be kind of weaving together these characters a little bit more than we thought, because it was initially sold as John Stewart Green Lantern book. But it seems like Teen Lantern is going to be around a lot, and maybe he's bringing in this Far Sector character. Overall, like I said, I wasn't as intrigued as the first issue, but I enjoyed it, and it was all executed well.
Let's say I'll give my thoughts. I liked a lot of the world building here with what Thorne is doing. The lore of the Fifth World and the Dark Sector stuff is really interesting to me. I like the Crux worlds, the shakeup of the core going through that thought. It's a lot of ideas and breakdowns on what he's going to do with the characters. I also felt that Soy and Santucci here were even better than they were in the first issue. I was loving, all of it, and then it felt like another big step idea that was totally down for until the issue ended with the central power battery exploding, which is like the umpteenth time that's happened now. So really, the more things changed, the more they stayed the same, which was like, it was very progressive, and then it just digressed a lot with that move for me. Like, not abandoning the book at all, but I do have to air grievance about how it seems that all anyone has done post Jeff Johns' era of Green Lantern has kind of had the core on the brink of, losing its powers and like losing dwindling numbers. And they were just kind of about to do this whole like big expansion deal, and then Oa gets obliterated from the power battery. It's just like this frustrating standpoint that's just like a trope that's been far overdone at this point. But like I said, I like a lot of the building here. I like how he's juggling the characters. I believe it's Joe Mullen. At least that's how I've heard it pronounced with other people covering Far Sector, which I still haven't read Far Sector yet. I'm waiting for it to finish. I think it's only got 1 more issue. It was delayed because of the pandemic, but I like it. I'm waiting to see what happens here, and I'm definitely intrigued. So 2 issues in the can, I think, has been a success for me on Jeffrey Thorne's Green Lantern run. So I'll head into Marauders, which I believe is, this is our only X-Men book of the week, which is Jerry Duggan, Stefano Caselli, Edgar Delgado, and Chris Sotomayor on colors. So two-person color team here, but I'm pretty sure Caselli's done like I think the last 2 to 3 issues. So Storm is leaving the team, as it's very prominent Storm cover too. So she's getting a going away party of sorts from the team as they're at sea, and they're all trading their respective favorite Storm stories involving her. A very good slice of life issue here. We get the Storm highlight reel as she's leaving the team and going off to something else, which I don't know what that is yet. In the other 5 X-Men books that are announced a week, it seems, I don't know which one Storm's going to be a part of, but I have to say, overall, it feels a little shallow, as I felt Storm was never a big factor in this book, even from issue 1. And sadly, because she was tied up, Vince, if you remember from that stuff in Giant Size, where she had that like techno virus thing, from the vault. I think that's what it was. They had to do that, basically video game side quest with Phantom X to get her a cure. So the bulk of her time as a Marauder, she was kind of in the background of the book, or not a part of it. But at least we put her over strong here on the way out, which is nice. The gag with how many knives does Storm have on her costume, I thought was a little weird but entertaining. The next part of the issue is Emma and Kate going, basically going along and prepping for the Hellfire Gala, which I think is our next. We've talked about it. It's the next X-Men event. It's not an event. It's just like a line leading. I guess I don't fully know, but I don't think it's an event. It's just like a thing that's happening in X-Men. But and then the closing here is Emma joining Sebastian Shaw on the deck of the ship as they're telling stories, and apparently Shaw wants Lourdes Chantel back there and wishes that she was back there, which Emma agrees. And Shaw proposes a new idea for it looks like they're scheming between themselves now. So that's Marauders number 20. It was good, but it was also like kind of bittersweet and maybe a missed point because like Storm was tied down with other things for like 2 years since the start of this I guess era under Hickman overseeing X-Men.
Yeah, exactly like you said. It's kind of weird because Storm was not super prominent in this title. She kind of slipped out of it for a long time, and maybe the Hellfire Gala is going to kind of refocus it because I think that title is sort of slightly mostly spinning out of Marauders, or at least Marauders as like the most relevant title to it. I would imagine there's like a letter in the beginning of this issue, which is Emma Frost talking about it, and obviously you'd expect Emma and Jumbo Carnation, for the gala. It makes sense, and obviously it's Hellfire Gala. So, but that said, well, back to what I'm saying. Hopefully, the Hellfire Gala kind of refocuses this book, but I've felt like Marauders has like really dropped off the past 10 issues or so. Just completely lost its momentum. When for the first like 2 to 3 issues at the very least, it was one of the most exciting X-Men books. But I think the extended period when Kitty was dead, and then some art inconsistencies and other things like that, it just kind of lost my interest. Lourdes Chantel is a deep cut to classic X-Men number 7, a like a backstory story, a flashback story on the Hellfire Club. And while I was double checking that, I had no idea there was a Hellfire Club miniseries around 2000 by Ben Robb and Charlie Adlard. There's always some, even for me, there's always some really obscure X-Men thing from like the 90s or 2000s that, I mean, I'm sure I've seen it at some point, in my life, but there's just so much junk in the history of the X-Men. Every once in a while, you'll stumble upon something.
Yeah, well, turning the focus back onto just Jerry Duggan here, I believe Duggan is the one who is writing because X Men's getting relaunched as just X Men again. They're not continuing with the numbering, which I have to say is annoying, to say the least. But I think Jerry Duggan's writing the Krakoan X Men team book, which hopefully
Yeah.
that's more standard superhero flair, which has been my biggest issue with the Hickman X Men book. It's just threading ideas I'm assuming other writers are going to take hold of for years to come. But what is going to happen to Marauders now that Jerry Duggan's going to be between two books? I don't fully know, but I know he's written multiple books before, but I don't know if he's written multiple team books at the same time. So we'll see what happens with that. But I would say that the last 5 issues or so for me definitely treading water. I liked the Kitty death and rebirth stuff, but I do have to say, like the minute we hit X's Swords, that was the moment that this book just kind of just is took a nosedive, and I think we're waiting for someone to grab the controls and bring it back up and just refocus it. So I think optimistically, I think the Hellfire Gala is the perfect time to put refocus back into it because it definitely, like you said, it's being positioned more of a Marauders event centric thing than the other teams, for example. But if you have nothing else on Marauders, we'll talk about is this your favorite book at Marvel right now? You love it every time you talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have to think hard. on what else could be the contender for that, but this is definitely up there. Strange Academy number 10, Scotty Young and Berto Ramos. This is field trip day at school. They were taking a yellow school bus across the Rainbow Bridge to Asgard. And two of our students are from Asgard, as we know, though one of them is now a bully and trying to screw with Doyle and flirt with Doyle's girl, Emily. And he's kind of teasing that Doyle won't be accepted in Asgard due to his father being a villain, which kind of makes sense. I mean, obviously, Asgard, that's where Thor's from, very hero-centric, but, Loki and tons of villains are from there. And this is the Catesified version of Asgard. So I guess Galactus's helmet is just kind of sitting there. Thor could not make it, probably busy doing Donny Cates stuff. So Volstagg is the guide for all the students. And of course, because it's him, the first thing they go to do is to one of the feast halls and they chow down on some food. And here we have another relationship being set up where the fairy girl and the Crystal Warrior / Man-Thing kid, Toth, they start dating. And it turns out that the bully kid, half of the Asgardian twins, well, not just him, but the Asgardians twins, their father is just like some random Asgardian guard, but their mother is actually Enchantress. And the kind of snotty bully one goes to visit her in prison. And Doyle sneaks out to follow because he's curious, what is this guy who's been mean to me doing? And he basically keeps the secret for him. So now they have a connection. They both have villain parents, and Doyle, didn't tell everyone. So maybe they'll be friends and, keep evolving the chemistry between all these students. Back in the hall, there's basically a bar fight that starts because whoever bumps into someone, and then there's like the ice giant girl who gets in a fight, and then Toth gets bumped. So the fairy girl, who's now his new girlfriend, who's like super hyper about it, she's throwing punches and everything. So the whole school gets kicked out of Asgard. But beforehand, Doyle and Emily sneak off and they kiss again, and this time both of them are actually alive, rather than Emily kissing Doyle like Sleeping Beauty style to bring him back to life. There's also Enchantress teases a possible prophecy about her sons. So that's something that can come up. And there's several lingering prophecies here. There's something with Emily. There's something with Doyle, of course, being Dormammu's son. So this is still fantastic stuff. Based on the cover, I think the next issue might focus on Toth, which I think would be cool. I knew he was a Weird World thing and related to Man-Thing, some kind of weird coupling. But just now I'm putting together that his crystal biology is related to the obscure Marvel character entitled Crystar, the Crystal Warrior, which I believe the concept for that title, it only ran like 10 issues. It's in like the late 80s, I think. The concept was, after the success of things like G.I. Joe and Transformers and other licensed comics, Marvel was like, let's create basically a new character 100% ourselves and then try and sell it to toy companies for them to make a toy, rather than reverse, like the toy company coming to license to Marvel. And I think it basically didn't work, or maybe it did, and it was just like a very obscure, complete failure of a toy like Rom. And I maybe like later on, I think by way of Jason Aaron, the Crystal Warriors lore was integrated into Weird World around Secret Wars, and then there was a title that followed Secret Wars, I believe, written by Sam Humphries with slightly different concepts. And I mean, then just connecting the web a little more, obviously that makes sense because Strange Academy also otherwise is picking up a lot of Jason Aaron stuff from the Doctor Strange perspective. So this weird kid who's half Crystar and half Man-Thing. Also, he like doesn't say a single word in the entire book, at least so far. He's interesting, so I'd like to see, if we can go to Weird World, that'll be fun. Like maybe it'll be a field trip arc, I'm not sure, or who knows. Actually, I will say one last thing on Crystar, because one of the issues of Crystar, I don't remember if it's the first issue, but one of them is where Danzig, well, Glenn Danzig / the band Danzig got their logo. He just like ripped it off of a cover of Crystar. That's where his logo came from. And that's where I'll end with Strange Academy. Really enjoying it. Some good character acting and expressions and stuff from Humberto Ramos again. Been really impressed by his work.
We'll talk about the Good Asian #1. This is from Pornsak Pichetso and Alexander Tafagi with Lee Luffridge on colors. Probably the book I was most excited for this week, from the premises of me and Vince are both big fans of noir and crime genre, and then Pichetso categorizes this as a Chinatown noir and the Backmiter write-up, which we'll talk about that later, but I think it was well worth the read for this issue. It gives a lot of context and details the research that went into this book, but especially for the setting and backdrop of the story. But the story here is that the Hawaiian-based detective Edison Hark is in San Francisco trying to track down what's happened to his adoptive father's, Asian maid who's disappeared, and he finds out that they had romantic feelings for one another, but they never acted on it. But something's happened where she's disappeared, and his son Frankie, who's basically like his brother, wants bring him in to figure out what's going on, and wants Edison to try to track her down. So his search takes him back to Chinatown, where he meets a young boy, where he's led to the back of a walk-in basement, where it's kind of like, think the hatch is where you open up, and then inside there's a dead body of a half white, half Asian man who, throws this case even more deeper, and knows that if something, people find out that this man was murdered, it's going to be a whole big thing. But that's where you're left off. It's the opening part of essentially like a Raymond Chandler novel. And where do you go from here? Though in the back matter material, the series is bringing up the issues of police violence, racism, and definitely is examining them. Hark, being from Hawaii, takes inspiration from the real life detective Chang Apana, who was a detective in the 1950s. I believe he became a detective in 1957. So that is much later than this. This takes place, I believe, in 1936. And in turn, Apana was the inspiration for the character Charlie Chan, who starred in movies, shows, and comics, but was almost always played by a white actor. And that was also, came later on. The series is set in the backdrop of the fallout of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and 1875's Page Act, which banned immigrants from China to the United States. That's the only act which banned an entire ethnic group from the United States. Also mentioned is the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which expanded the ban to include Asians and Arabs, and that's also mentioned in the opening pages. And this is the first age. The real setting of this is the first age of Chinese immigrants to come of age under a ban of an immigration ban, as like I said before, it's set in 1936. I really, really like this. I thought, the story is interesting. Our character of Edison Hark's pretty interesting too, as like he has two very different experiences. So he's trying to uphold the law while also have to dealing with corrupt cops and racism at the same time, and what's exactly going on in Chinatown. And also, he's now placed in this environment where he's not really respected by either side. So I think this is really, really good. And I'd say the color work from Lee Luffridge was really, really good. Especially the scenes at night. There's some really nice, like, cool blues and purples that bring life to it. Even on the opening pages where you see the Golden Gate Bridge at night was also like really good. I'm intrigued. Vince, what did you think?
I really enjoyed it. For me, I mean, there was definitely the historical angle, and I don't want to totally pigeonhole, which is this was going to sound like, but this did, just because there's not that many examples, I did think of Superman Smashes the Klan as far as bringing in actual historical elements, from the Asian American perspective. And I didn't actually read it. I'm assuming a lot of the things that you were noting are from this, but there's an editorial in the back, similar to how Jin Luen Yang would explain, kind of like an appendix or footnotes explain a lot of the historical context and inspirations for the story. So I wouldn't be super surprised if it was like partly inspired, like, hey, that was, an Asian American creator, like really, digging into the archives and bringing it into genre fiction within comics. The story was really interesting, but for me, I was completely blown away by the art, both uh, the actual artist and the colors. Really cool, interesting stuff, like perfect noir thing. This can stand right alongside, your classic noir comics. And I was really impressed, so I'm going to keep reading it.
And then we can also look for the Pornsack to have a story next week, and I believe he has a story in the DC Festival of Heroes Asian Heritage mega, I guess, special, which comes out next week. So
Yeah.
that'll be fun to see as well. I think with the same artist. That I'm not sure. I might be wrong on that. I think it's the same team, but I guess we'll pivot from that, and you're going to talk about Hey Kids Comics Profits and Loss.
Yes, the first issue of this second miniseries in Howard Chaykin's historical fiction take on the early comics industry. I have not read the first series, so I have no clue. I have no clue how much directly this picks up on characters or not. I'm pretty sure it does, but it's still like it's entering a new chapter in history. So I didn't feel that I was missing a ton. And also it's just like based on the real history of comics. So like I know what I missed essentially. This is circa, the Wortham, like the, Frederick Wortham and the Senate hearings and basically all those like moral scares in that era of comics. So like post-war 50s era. At least that's where we're set up, and that is where most of this takes place. But actually, we start in 1970 with two kids. They're basically forced into having a sleepover, hanging out with each other because their school bus crashes due to insane snowstorm. And one kid's older brother collects comics, but both this kid's father and his older brother are drafted to Vietnam. So they're off, and he's just with his single mother. And I guess that's a totally realistic scenario that could have happened, but like it's so weird to think about that, and it's like kind of screwed up. Um, but his older brother, who's off in Vietnam, has a sizable collection of comics, and this is the 70s, so he's bagging and boarding them, which was still relatively rare, in 1970. So, but this other kid who's kind of staying at his house is fascinated by the comics. So he basically like he was like, "Hey, can I check this out?" But then he takes one of them with him, so he basically like steals it. And I'm guessing that we're gonna come back to scenes of this kid, but not in this issue. So it's really just an aside, which I'm assuming will connect later, and as the series goes on, it may converge, or we'll get caught up to that. Back to 1951, and we learn that the equivalent in universe of DC, these are all fictional company names, all fictional people names, but most of them are based directly on certain companies or creators or executives or like ideas and movements in comics and things like that. So the equivalent of DC has won their case against the equivalent of Fawcett, referring to the Superman versus Shazam / Captain Marvel whole thing. And Fawcett has decided to just throw in the towel with regards to the comics. There's some commentary on how both the end of the war and the dawn of TV really put a dent in the comics market as people looked for other entertainment, but also a huge factor in comic sales during the war was all those GIs overseas and domestically on bases and things like that. That was a large part of the market, and they just assumed that like that would be picked up by kids, and it kind of was, kind of wasn't. And there are other companies sticking through though, even while a ton have fallen. There is an EC equivalent where the son of the previous owner is now in charge because his father died. So that's referring to Max Gaines. And then he's got different kinds of creators and employees on hand. Some of them are like more lowbrow, some are more highbrow, basically referencing like Harvey Kurtzman. And they're like, let's just try shifting into all kinds of crazy new genres. So they start doing like horror books, and there's jokes about like, hey, put some more sweat on that woman's breasts in the comic, or like put some more blood on that axe and things like that. Um, and but they also create their version of Mad, and then they get ripped off. All the other companies, make their version of Mad. And instead of Seduction of the Innocent, there's a book written by a psychologist named Westgate, and it's called The Betrayal of Childhood. So that leads to, and there's also a senator who gets all gung ho. He's like, "Ooh, I'm going to get all this, reputation and attention if I, crusade against these comics." So there's select people that team up and try and crack down on comics. We see some scenes of parents and people burning comics, and then the Comics Code Authority, which in this instance, they just straight up use the Comics Code Authority and that classic, stamp logo that exists, and the EC guys, which this is like sort of what happened in real life, but not really. In real life, the EC guys just focused way more. They just shifted focus and made Mad their priority, and Mad's shifted from a comic book to a magazine. But he's slightly combining companies where now in this version of events, they shift to black and white and shift to magazines similar to companies like Warren and even a lot of what Marvel put out, where they're not technically comics according to the postal system and things like that. So they could still get away with mature content. And it was cheaper in some regards, but also appealing to a different audience, et cetera, et cetera. This book is kind of like cracked for me, but I wouldn't really recommend this to many. It is pretty much basically like a Wikipedia page history of the comics, just with every proper noun changed. It's kind of weird to read, especially if you know all that history. And that's not even getting into Chaikin's style, which is obviously can be very divisive to some. But I enjoy this. I'm not sure that I'll talk about subsequent issues on the show. This is kind of like my excuse to check it out, and then I'll probably um, buy the trade of the first series and then buy the one for this. Just an excuse to check it out and discover that I'm into it. And now, without further ado, we're going into our retro book, our final book for today's show. This is Batman number 181 from 1966. Now, there are two stories here. But first, the cover, which is the main story and the reason I chose this book. The cover is by Carmine Infantino. It's pretty iconic. This is the first appearance of Poison Ivy. Though actually, if you actually look closely, Infantino's face for Ivy is kind of weird. And we're a bit into the Infantino New Look era already, at least on Detective Comics, because Infantino gets to sign his name on the cover. Later on, he has a pinup inside the book that he signs. But on this first story and the second one, the art is credited to Bob Kane, even though this first one is totally Sheldon, I believe nicknamed Shelley Moldoff. So the story here, Bruce and Dick, they're at a pop art show, so very 60s, Andy Warhol inspired. And I guess the show is, it's not clear if they're photos or paintings, but they're just like pictures of these famous criminal women that wear stupid, silly costumes. And Poison Ivy just pops up out of nowhere in costume, claiming to be an even cooler and better criminal than those women. She's the number one public enemy woman criminal. And her lipstick that she pulls out has some kind of electric reaction and it blinds everyone in the room. So she escapes and now has some notoriety. And with everyone blinded, that allows Bruce to get into costume right in the open with people literally 2 feet away from him. And while he's still blinded, he jumps headfirst down an elevator. And honestly, I might be slightly exaggerating, but that scene where he jumps down the elevator, probably the most exciting part of the book in terms of like the art and action. Ivy can't decide whether she's into Bruce or Batman more, but she also it's more like which one she's more into, like teasing and joking on him and stuff. And Ivy wants to take out the other three competing criminals, and they all have silly names. I mean, her name's Poison Ivy, but they have names like the Queen Moth and whatever, and they wear, the fishnets, and the Moth chick has a silly costume. So she takes them out, then runs into Batman. She kisses Batman. Robin's here the whole time, but like he just kind of throws all the second punches, and he like kind of saves Batman, or like kicks him out of it when he gets kissed by Ivy, but he's really just kind of in the background. And then they lock up Poison Ivy. And what's interesting is she actually shows up next 2 issues later. So I think we're in, I don't know if that's that. I mean, it's only 2 issues. Granted, Batman may have been coming out not monthly, like it may have still been like every quarter or bi-monthly or something like that. I'm not sure. I didn't check that. But even if it was slower release, I don't think that they brought back Ivy because there was great response to her. This might just be in the era where like they were like really leaning back into the capes, and they're like, hey, we came up with this silly looking cool villain, so let's bring her back really quickly. Whereas earlier in the early on, there's so many villains that it would be huge gaps of time before they showed up again. Then, like I said, there's a signed pinup by Infantino between the stories. The second story is by Gardner Fox and Chick Stone, and it's the same length. So obviously, the Poison Ivy one is the one that everyone remembers. It's what the cover's based on. It's the only one with any historical significance. But this one is about Batman in costume being a member of a mystery analyst club, which includes Jim Gordon, the district attorney, a reporter, and a mystery novelist. And the mystery is that like someone impersonated her and submitted a manuscript to her publisher under her name, imitating her style, and she won an award for it. So the mystery is like figuring out where this novel came from. It's pretty stupid. Batman figures it out, of course. There's a little bit of action along the way. Like I said, less interesting than the first story, but fun detectiving at least. Chickstone's art feels so much older than Moldoff's, which in turn feels older than Infantino's. Overall, this feels close to the TV show, even though the common narrative is like, if you ask like Batman fans or like the Wikipedia pages will tell you that the new look was trying to move away from the campiness and moving away from the what the TV show was picking up on and what the TV show was propagating. But these are both really campy, and especially like the pop art angle and then the like mystery novel. It feels like the TV show. So, I don't really know if that narrative is fake or if it doesn't like fully lock in until later. But like I said earlier in the show, the Ivy appearance is neat because she was in that Swamp Thing. I tried quickly looking, but I'm not precisely sure when she kind of veers in a different direction. Like in Swamp Thing, she's green and she has powers. I don't know when that happens. Honestly, it might be like similar to like, how other villains drastically changed, like Mr. Freeze. Honestly, the green skin might have been an animated series thing, or at least maybe even as late as Crisis. I'm pretty sure it's surprisingly modern, similar to other changed characters. But it was an interesting read. I've never read this first appearance of Poison Ivy, and I think it was worth trying at least once.
Well, to start with, I guess it's not a rebuttal, but to my experience with the issue, at least focusing on Poison Ivy, we saw her kind of go through that metamorphosis in No Man's Land. The green skin, I believe, is from New Batman Adventures, which places it at 97. And then Greg Rucka in the comics does his arc in the New Gotham era with Poison Ivy, which is what, around 2000, so 3 years after New Batman Adventure starts. So let's place that at that time. In my notes, I do have stuff about the TV show. We'll talk about that in a second. But overall, I think it's a very fun and basic issue. I didn't read the second story. All my notes are for the Poison Ivy story here. I stupidly thought that the second story was a backup because normally that happens. But I at least flipped through it though. But looks like I didn't miss much. But I wasn't expecting much fleshed out for Poison Ivy here, and she really just shows up and is captured by issue's end. We don't even learn her first name, which I don't, or background, or that she has powers. Vince kind of talked about that already, but yeah, feels like the tone is fighting itself a little bit. Like the comics aren't fully getting darker toned yet. It's still quite campy and echoing the show, which just aired back in January of 1966. Now, because of street dates, this would have been earlier. So, for all we know, who knows when this really came out? But I mean, it's the show debuts in January of 1966, and it's a surefire hit. The even the ending box of the questions and sign off are very reminiscent of the TV show's cliffhanger endings, where you'll get the voiceover of like, can Batman and Robin get out of this? Like, it's not quite like that, but it's like, when will we see Poison Ivy again? It's things like that. That's a similarity, but the show is still so new that it's hard for me to take note to even see it in 1966 that the comics are taking keynotes from the show, especially at least in of the publication date of June 1966. It's very hard for me to see that. I think when people start talking about the comics getting darker, I really don't think that's until you get Frank Robbins and Dennis O'Neil and like 68 and 69 to 1970. I think that's when the shift starts to really turn, because the show goes off the air in 68. So maybe we can even say 67. It starts to pivot a little bit, but I've read, because of Showcase Batman Volume 5, which is the start of that with Robbins and O'Neil. I think that was a good place bet of where things were still getting darker, but from what I read out of that Showcase volume, there's still a heavy dose of camp here and there too. It's not fully dark yet, but my biggest issue with this, with the issue itself, would be Sheldon Moldoff. And I never want to bury a legend, Vince, but this issue to me just shows the art divide between Marvel and DC in the 1960s. And at this point, we've read a fair amount of 60s and 70s books from both companies. And I can look at a Jack Kirby issue of Fantastic Four, and I get a sense of movement and energy from the pages, especially with the action. Moldoff, it's just very stiff. It's like I'm watching an action figure's arms be placed to the action. The most I definitely agree. The most exciting part of the issue when Batman is diving down the elevator shaft, but it's so stiff when he's making the daring escape. It looks so awkward the way Batman's falling and tries to contort his body. And then when he has to fight the goons outside, he just kind of launches these fists very awkwardly, like he's standing still. And the next panel, it's just like you can see the arm is just like at an almost 45-degree angle slant, and it's just out. There's no sense of impact on the punch at all. It's very stiff, which it's such a divide between both companies at this point. The faces are good, but a lot of the same face, especially for the women's characters. A lot of the women characters here all just have the same face but different hair styles and color. The most interesting notes here I took are that apparently this marks Batman's first time changing into costume in public, which he does, of course, without problem because everyone's blinded. And the next is that Robin being painted that Batman is his idol more so than his partner. Robin is kind of an afterthought here. He kind of just bookends the issue. But overall, it's fun to go and look and see how 1966, we're right at the start of the show. The show has just aired, and what's exactly happening with the comic books to try to see what's taking note from who, if anything, because June 66 is still kind of pretty early for anything to really start rubbing off on anything yet. But it definitely interesting, but it also is kind of disappointing that Poison Ivy is really just woman in a costume with some evil lipstick. Of course, she becomes much more fleshed out later as the years go on. And, that's the case for when a character's been around for over, going on 50 years at this point. And I guess the next big thing would be, I'm still surprised that Bob Kane was getting any credits on Batman in the 1960s. I would have thought he would have been totally removed from anything by that point, but I guess not.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of what you said. As far as Batman becoming like dark, that's definitely like the O'Neill, Adams, Robbins kind of era Novick, but I believe, I mean, maybe it's just way overemphasized, but there is the new look. That's when like Bob Kane like finally, slowly, loosely, stops being the Batman, person that DC claims does everything, and mostly led by Carmen Infantino, but also Moldoff was drawing at the time as well. And like that's when you get the yellow oval. I think that's when, and this makes sense because we see Ivy here, and I said she shows up in like 2 issues. I think this is around when they start like really leaning into like trying to create more supervillains and having them appear more often rather than the 50s where it was like almost like sci-fi stories or like wacky stuff and things like that. So maybe it's not that they were moving away from the show because this is also like you said, this is like on top of the show. So maybe that is like a misnomer that some people accidentally say, but this is in the middle of like a weird evolution for Batman, and then a couple years later, there's a arguably much more drastic evolution. But it's fascinating to see. I mean, I don't really have a problem with this version of Ivy. Like, obviously, this is very dated. It's from 1966 as far as like her whole like female villain gimmick and like the lipstick and like wanting to kiss Batman, even though that's still a part of her. But I honestly, to some degree, I prefer the Ivy that's just like, I mean, she's a botanist and she's good with plants and maybe she can manipulate plants, using chemicals and like things like that to do crazy stuff, and like use chemical weapons from plants. But like, I kind of prefer that version of Ivy over like the more like powered, like swamp thingy kind of version. But that's kind of just my preference.
Yeah, yeah. I would say it's more. I would say this take here, you say you kind of like it, but at the same time, to me, it came off that she's just kind of Catwoman in a different costume. She's just kind of the female villain who kind of has the hots for Batman, and then is quickly disposed of, to be seen reoccurring. The funny thing to note is that in the show, I believe Catwoman's played by 3 different actresses, and it's if Poison Ivy was around, I wouldn't have been surprised if they would have done the same thing with Poison Ivy, because the overlap here and the way the characters are at this point in time are very similar. But the show didn't. I mean, the show had plenty of villains, but also plenty of villains they created just for the show themselves. To my knowledge, Poison Ivy was never brought into the show. But I guess the way Poison Ivy makes her appearance, I guess I could infer some sort of that, because she makes it at a party, which is what she does in Batman and Robin in 1997. Maybe they looked at this issue for slight inspiration there. Not a total similarity to it by any means, except for the party and the kind of the way she announces herself. But outside of that, I would definitely agree. This is definitely an unexplored era of Batman for me, and maybe something I want to start digging through to figure out exactly when switches start happening. And because I think Poison Ivy is one of the later additions to the Rogues Gallery, and then I think it stops for a good, maybe it stops for a while, and then we have the kind of new wave of villains when we get to the Alan Grant Brayfocal era, because they have their whole creations in the mid to late 80s through the 90s. So it's
Yeah,
just interesting to see how long it takes for some villains to get created.
yeah. I mean, you've got 2 or 3 in the O'Neill and Adams. I mean, obviously Roz, but also Man Bat. Um, but yeah, this is and it's honestly, this is an era that DC's been kind of iffy on as well, because I think because also the thing is like like the new look is usually regarded as starting Silver Age Batman, which is, it's always weird because this at this point we're several years ahead of Fantastic Four, which feels ahead of this. But we're also,
Yes.
from the overall DC perspective, the overall industry perspective, this is like 10 years after Flash. So Batman kind of lagged into the Silver Age. And so like, when they did the archives, I think they started later on. And in fact, the showcases probably started with New Look, not with the Golden Age, because you said like, the O'Neill and Adams, it's only like volume 6, and those books aren't humongous. So like, if they had started at the Golden Age, it would be, volume 20 something or whatever. But um, I mean, really, the besides Showcase, there is Tales of the Batman Infantino, but the difficulty of that is because of DC's creator-centric collections that they sometimes do.
Yeah.
That's only the Infantino stuff. It's the same challenge that you get a couple years later with when DC is always so focused on Neil Adams, so you miss a lot of the Frank Robbins things and Herb Novik and stuff like that. So here you'd be missing this issue, like first appearance of Poison Ivy. Like I mean, obviously there are books where they do those like villain centric anthology where it's like the best hits of Poison Ivy, of Mad Hatter, of Clayface, but like you'd be surprised that this issue is not like in one of those like comprehensive era collections, just
Well,
because of
the
who
thing
did it.
for the Infantino collection would be that you just get this cover. That'd be it.
Yeah,
Because
probably.
that's another thing that'll just kind of grind your gears about those collections where they're so picky. Where like I think there's even some of I think with the Brayfocal ones, if Brayfocal didn't do the cover, it just goes to the issue. They don't have the cover on there, and I'm just like, well, what? You can't do one page of the cover, even if it's by
Yeah.
someone else. It's ridiculous. But with that, we had a healthy discussion on some Silver Age Batman, but it's time for picks of the week.
My pick, I'm going to give to Strange Academy, but I think Good Asian, very, very close runner-up.
I'd say Good Asian is my pick of the week. I was excited for it when I saw it announced. I'm happy it lived up to that hype that I had for it. And then Strange Academy is for you what I kind of feel like Iron Man is for Dan. If that's on the rundown, it's a pretty healthy dose for when you give it a pick of the week. I do love that cover. That was almost our cool cover of the week on that one. But I like that Marauders cover with Storm and the Kitty Nightcrawler and Storm and the classic covers just a little bit more. But overall, that's our show for this week. I think we have a bunch of books next week as we are back to, at least for now, until we never know what we might decide to do on short notice. But we're back to reviewing new books, and fun week to come back to. And we got a bunch of books next week, so stay tuned, stay safe. See you. Goodbye.
Michael, press the wrong button.